My beginning at St. John's, I was born and raised in Belleville, and I came here to attend Carleton University. And during my college days, I had friends who were at St. John's. I was friends with Dana Johnson, who's in the Rogues Gallery of former rectors of St. John's. And so she invited me she knew I had interest in religion, and I was religious. I'd been brought up in the United Church in Belleville. She would invite me to St. John's, and I would attend from time to time. And I got back involved in the church when I was living in Toronto. I lived in Toronto from the end of '75 to the beginning of '82. And I got involved there at Bloor Street United Church and had my coming out experience in the church at Bloor Street Church with Cliff Elliott was the minister there at the time, and he plays a great role in my reconnecting body and spirit back in the late '70s. At the time, I was the only openly gay member of the church, and that's one of the reasons when I came out immediately, he wanted me to serve as a volunteer. Within 2 years, I was serving on Board of Session and all that stuff. And then I came to Ottawa, and I tried out a few churches. I lived in the market. I tried out a few churches, including St. Albans, which I attend now. The first church I went to was Dominion Chalmers. This was in 1982. And it was led at the time by a Dr. Churchill, who was the head honcho of a faction in the United Church called the Community of Concern, which was the anti-gay faction. And I have never been made to feel so uncomfortable as I felt on my first visit to Dominion Chalmers. So then I looked around other denominations, and I went to St. Albans. I wasn't impressed there. So I was diagnosed HIV positive in '85. I was referred to the clinic at the General Hospital. It would have been, I don't know, it was '87, '88. And one of the first people I met at that clinic was Bruce Marshall. He was one of my doctors. And he, through just chatting with our visits, which were pretty frequent at the beginning of, that process, he found out my interest in religion and invited me to St. John's to the monthly AIDS prayer service. So that got me going to St. John's, reconnected with St. John's. And so, that's what got me through the door, and I started attending Sunday mornings. And frankly, I was looking for a place to die. I was looking for a church to hold my funeral. But as I got more and more involved, things started to take off. And it was a very positive response I got from people when I showed up. And I considered myself out, but not outrageous. But the event I do remember, and the event that I thought was seminal for certainly my spiritual development and my political activity in the church, we did a study on homosexuality put out by the National Church. It was called Hearing Diverse Voices, Seeking Common Ground. So it was 6 chapters, 6 weeks of study. And things were going just fine. We had a small group at St. John's. It was a very good discussion. And on week number 5, and I still remember that, it was the 5th week, we got to this session on Scripture. And the entire focus of that particular chapter, of that particular evening, was all the clobber passages in the Bible. And I was outraged. I was outraged. I was screaming in that session. And so the small group invited me to come back and prepare a response to this. And I gave it to them the following week. This is what I think about this. This is what I think about that. And they said, oh, wow, never thought of this before. And I was invited to preach that, or to give the same talk during the sermon time on a Sunday morning, which I did a few weeks later. And that caused a little consternation. Garth Bulmer was rector, and he told me that 6 households left the parish because of what I had been invited to say. And he said, that's fine. We'll turn this corner. And that kind of started it, for me at least. But I think for the community as a whole, that meant that we were not nibbling around the edges. We were going to go into this whole hog. At least the discussion, the conversation, and that started me off on a process not only within the church, but within the diocese and within the national church. I can't remember, what was it? It was the General Synod that was in, I remember the General Synod that was in St. Catherine's, and I think that's 2004. And Garth was part of the Ottawa delegation to that General Synod too. And I remember his resolution that the church affirm the committed long-term relationships of persons of the same sex. And that really started at the national church, a course which, all the dominoes started to fall. It's falling very slowly, but it set up a process. It certainly set up a process where the essentials people, so that's the fundamentalists within the Anglican Church of Canada, decided, frankly, to leave. If they couldn't convert the rest of us, they were going to leave. And that was kind of the beginning of that fundamental shift in the makeup of the Anglican Church of Canada. The focus of my remarks goes to the first chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And this, I remember I was of a certain age when I first heard this used as a clobber passage. Of course, when I was growing up, no one talked about any of this stuff, right? So St. Paul's letter to the Romans, which is a plea for the unity of the church, to stop the squabbling between the Jews and the Gentiles. Paul starts his letter by lambasting the Gentiles, by pointing out all the faults that the good Jewish people had about the Gentiles in the Roman community, and lists them all off. And among those is men sleeping with men. And then chapter 2 begins after he lists all these terrible traits of the Gentiles. He turns his attention to the Jews and said, you who condemn these people for all these things are doubly condemned, because you condemn those people and you do it yourself. And I'm going, how this passage can be used to condemn gay people. And the whole purpose of this letter, if you read the letter the way it's meant to be read, which is from beginning to end in one sitting, and not pull a verse out here and a verse out there in isolation. The whole purpose of St. Paul in this letter is to say that there are no outsiders in the Christian community. So you've completely perverted the purpose of the letter by pulling out these few sentences. And I end by quoting the letter to the Romans. I mean, one of the strongest statements of faith to be found in the whole Bible, which when St. Paul writes, there are neither princes or principalities, nor angels, nor archangels, blah, 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 that can separate you from the love of God through Jesus Christ. When I got the medical diagnosis that led me to stop working, and that would have been 1993, I started to volunteer in the AIDS community. I joined the board of the AIDS Committee of Ottawa, and also with the gay rights community. I became the volunteer parliamentary relations guy with AGAL Canada, that we're working through, using the Charter of Rights and working through changing the legislation around gay relationships. Um, so the people I knew from that community knew that I was part of the St. John's community. And they would say, you'll probably never see me there, Ron, but we're so thankful that little red brick church on Elgin Street is there. We know that's a place where we can go. And that persisted for a while. I also, we established a local integrity chapter here in Ottawa. And that was for people mainly, the people who came to our monthly Eucharists were mainly people who had been raised in the Anglican Church but felt they had no place to go. So we would have this monthly Eucharist. And then, well, I and Monica Patton from St. John's, also after we had a series of conferences. I think over the years there were 4. We had held one of these conferences at St. John's, and we decided as a follow-up what we would try to do was establish some sort of diocesan effort. And John Baycroft was bishop at the time. And he was trying as hard as he could to shut down this conversation. And through happenstance, Monica and I attended a meeting of the Diocesan Executive Council, Executive Committee, to make this pitch to establish what we called a diocesan task group on gays and lesbians. And it was simply to encourage to the extent we could, or to respond to pastoral needs as they arose, to encourage the conversation about the issue in parishes around the diocese. And it happened that we were on the agenda just following a presentation by Bishop Baycroft on Indigenous residential schools. So I started our presentation by saying that what we needed to stop was shutting down the conversation. Because we had just heard from Bishop Baycroft what happens when there is tacit agreement not to talk about something. Worked beautifully. Even Bishop Baycroft didn't know how to respond quite. So we started this effort. And that was very slow, and not a lot of people took us up, but it got us going in the diocese. I would be present at every diocesan synod with a table with literature, blah, 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 blah. And then when Peter Coffin became bishop, subject to a motion made at one diocesan synod, he established another task force which encouraged people to go across the diocese and hold these conversations. And these things were all basically a stalling tactic, and I kind of realized it when we were doing this. But also like necessary. I would explain sometimes to people who would criticize how slow this process was going by talking about my experience in the United Church in Canada. I says, and they had a resolution passed, I believe it was in the late 80s, that being gay or lesbian wouldn't be an impediment to ordination for ministry. And the United Church thought they had dealt with the issue at that point. But I knew from my friends that there were several gay people ordained to practice ministry in the United Church of Canada, but they couldn't find a job. So they hadn't dealt with the issue because it takes time. You can't impose this on people. And through my life, I discovered this. And the experience I have from my professional interest, I worked here in Ottawa as a lobbyist for the oil industry. So I know things about polling and things like that. So if you ask the man on the street, what he thinks about gay people, You've given him like 2 seconds to think about it. You kind of know the sort of answer you're going to get. People need to be given the opportunity to think about this. And my experience was when most people were given that opportunity, those initial negative thoughts dissipated. Most people in North America really don't have a lot of reason to think about this. So I just kept with it. I mean, I was in for the long haul. I knew this would take time because what we were looking for was the support of the church for our relationships. Well, you can't force people to support you. You know, that has to grow organically, that people see and value our relationships. So, you know, I realized it was entirely reasonable that it took the time that it took. It was a messy beginning, but that whole process wasn't understood well. And I know people who tried to combine the civil marriage like in the parish hall and then move next door to the church and do the wedding. So there were a few kind of messy experiences like that. And then was after the 2018 General Synod, Bishop John just said, no, we're just doing the marriage. And he asked me to participate on his theological council to help develop what the rite would be, what the words would be that was used. And so the mess is no longer there. Couples who wish to get married can approach their priest and ask that he or she do it. So and part of that too, we also the Ottawa chapter of Integrity just dissolved because we came to the conclusion that these Anglican gay orphans that were out there no longer needed a special place of refuge, that there were enough parishes, I'm certain it's not all of them, but there were enough parishes around that no matter where you lived in the city, you would be able to find a community that would be supportive and would be able to care for you pastorally. The light had dispersed. But I've noticed every year since, St. John's is always a stalwart at the Pride Parade. You know, that aspect of its ministry never dissipated. There would be it was a monthly service, the last Sunday of every month. And I don't know when they started. I mean, I don't even know when I started coming. It would have been about 1990, 1991, and been going for a while. And it was Bruce and Mary Frances Marshall who were fundamental in getting this going. And there would be anywhere from a dozen people to half dozen people. It really like 10 to a dozen most months. There were some people who were attached to St. John's Parish and others that weren't attached. It'd be a mixture. About half the people usually would not be infected. Half the people would be infected. And a lot of different people passed through this. And then Mary Frances also played a fundamental role in the World AIDS Day service, which year after year was held at St. John's. And in those early years, the early 1990s, on that service, the church would be full. And it served a very valuable role in the community. I would realize the people in the pews on the World AIDS Day service, a lot of them were healthcare workers, but a lot from the gay and lesbian community and their friends and associates. These were people who had never been given the opportunity to grieve. The loved one had died. The family had whisked them away out of town, the remains, and there had never been a funeral in Ottawa. Um, so December 1st was an opportunity for everyone to attend a funeral. And that's kind of what the liturgy was about. There was always a candle lighting portion of the ceremony, or some way where someone can make the connection to that loved one. Yeah, and a lot of those people, you know, the same sort of people that would attend a funeral in a church, but would have no other reason to be in a church either except for a funeral or a wedding. So I was diagnosed HIV positive at the beginning of 1985. You know, and my doctors told me I should be ready to get my affairs in order, and I probably had 2 or 3 years left. During my worst days of dealing with my medical condition, Jerry Falwell Jr., you know, or Jerry Falwell, you know, AIDS is God's just punishment on gay people. And as things turned out, I've told many people, I do not believe that without the AIDS epidemic having struck North America and Europe and every country in the world, without that having happened, we would not have same-sex marriage today. The AIDS epidemic put on full display what was wrong with the system, where the injustice was. And the general population saw it, or saw enough of it, that we were able to modify the system to deal with that injustice. The world is a much better place today than it was because the AIDS epidemic happened. What upset me most about the church in those days, and so, you know, my experiences with the mainstream church, so, is that the fundamentalists were very loud and very noisy, proclaiming that this was God's judgment on gay people. This is all well and good. And from the mainline Christian churches, we heard nothing. They didn't repeat the negative stuff, but they didn't provide any countervailing message too. And this continues to be one of my chief hang-ups with our churches, our mainline traditional churches, on a whole host of issues. They're afraid to speak out. And so the fundamentalists dominate the stage. And in most people's minds, that's what the Christian church stands for. I mean, if you say nothing, you provide no countervailing message. Well, first thing, you've got to let people know. Everybody's welcome here, you know. Well, no, if that's all you say, no. If you want to target a certain segment of the population, you have to be very intentional about doing that and going out and frankly dragging them into your community. You know, invite them. You want to get to know someone, you invite them for dinner. There are too many churches I see, and again, all the mainstream denominations, where like evangelism seems to have become a dirty word for some reason, or people are just lazy, which is probably the more important reason, that they don't take seriously the job of forming new Christians. They just kind of say, oh, our doors are open, anyone who's interested can walk in. Well, you tell me if some other you know, line of work or profession or whatever, you just leave it at that and don't engage in active recruiting or education of at least a segment of the population to continue the work. You're not going to survive. St. John's was the place that took theology seriously And one of the things I most appreciated, like when I made my talk, there were 6 houses, as I said, so there were 6 households that left, but not all the conservative people left. Many of the conservative people stayed. And I got involved in like a charismatic group that was led by a very conservative woman. I got involved, one of the very conservative members of the congregation and I worked together on a Bible study group. We just met to discuss the lections of the Sunday. And we relished the fact that we could disagree with each other and have that discussion and not be at each other's throats. This is not only the gay issue, there are completely different perspectives on so many of these issues. And that's a place where I learned to thrive in doing that. I knew that if I was going to enter what was going to be a very contentious discussion, a very contentious meeting, I would pull out my Bible and read 1 Corinthians 13 before that meeting. The faith, hope, and love passage of St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Because that instructed me how to deal with my adversaries in debate. That never to cross the line that I lost my respect. I didn't treat them with respect. And one of the things I've discovered in my life is how very helpful St. Paul was in his letter to the Corinthians. That attitude works. Sometimes you deal with very nasty people. And I learned this especially during the same-sex debate in the church. You can deal with some very nasty people. And if you don't take the bait, they're lost. Never can treat your adversary with contempt. Never do it. Never do it. I would like people at St. John's to know how important their legacy is in this diocese and in the Anglican Church of Canada. I think I played an important role in that. So many people in that community. And it's part of the parish that I saw like in 1970. We weren't dealing with this particular issue, but St. John's Church in the day of Borden Purcell was very concerned about social justice issues and was always willing to go to the edge of the envelope and press it. In the 70s there, when in my student days, the issue was the ordination of women. And St. John's took it just as far as they could. And their point of view prevailed. I still miss the folks there, and it's always good when I go back. I was looking for something quite modest when I went back to St. John's, and it became a very, very important place in my life. And I am enormously grateful for that and for the support I got. I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to St. John's. What I got from my period of St. John's was literally more than I could have asked or imagined.